Welcome to the Pryority Report. Thank you so much for joining me as we discuss this week in news. I'm Ricky Pryor, editor of the Richmond Register, and this is the news you need to know about.
The Priority Report is brought to you by Cumberland Valley National Bank. Trusted for banking, known for caring. Visit them at cvnb.com. Chenault Vineyards, a place to create beautiful experiences. Visit them online at chenaultvineyards.com and kymedia.net.
It was another busy week in Madison County. Here's a quick recap of the headlines you might have missed. Train lovers were all aboard on Saturday as Berea celebrated its 22nd annual L&N Day. Meanwhile, bookworms rejoiced at the grand opening of the Tailless Dog Booksellers, Berea's new locally owned bookstore. Tea and pims were flowing at a local celebration for Queen Elizabeth II's Platinum Jubilee on Sunday, and the Old Soldiers Cemetery received a facelift thanks to a group of local scouts. Charter Communications, state and local officials kicked off construction of a fiber optic network expansion project which will provide spectrum services to more than 800 homes and businesses in Madison County. The Bluegrass Chemical Agent Destruction Pilot Plant celebrated the destruction of the last remaining M55 rocket containing VX nerve agent at BG And the Berea City Council approved a zoning change in Fairstown for a future industrial park despite concerns from some residents. In other news, City of Richmond Assistant Codes Director Gordon Lunsford is resigning his position with the city effective June 14th. Lunsford was one of hundreds named in a list of alleged sexual abusers within the Southern Baptist Convention released last month. In his resignation letter obtained by the Register through an open records request, Lunsford wrote, "It is with deep sadness that I leave the job I have loved since the day I started. However, I feel it is time to distance myself from the distraction of events that have taken place recently that have nothing to do with the performance of my duties." In October 2010, Lunsford pled guilty to a felony charge of unlawful transaction with a minor and a misdemeanor charge of sexual misconduct. He received 5 years of supervised probation and paid a victim more than $7,000 in restitution as part of his sentencing agreement. According to past Register articles and information from the list released by SBC, Lunsford worked as a youth minister in churches in Franklin County and Madison County. Representatives from First Baptist Church and Rosedale Baptist Church in Richmond confirmed that Lunsford had briefly been a part of their congregations. According to personnel files obtained by the Register, Lunsford began working as a building inspector for the city of Richmond in early 2008 and was promoted to the position of the Assistant Codes Director in May 2017. Calls and emails for comment from the Register to Lunsford, City Manager Rob Meinrich, and City Codes Planning, Safety, and Risk Director Philip Williams have not been returned. Less than 2 weeks after a mass shooting in Texas, a 19-year-old was arrested in Berea for possession of a loaded gun on school property, according to court documents. According to Hayes' arrest citation, police received a call on Sunday from a parks employee at the Berea City Pool. The employee told officers a teen was carrying a gun in his back pocket. When officers with the Berea Police Department arrived at the scene, they found 19-year-old Daniel Hayes, who was sitting near the pool with 2 others. According to police documents, an officer asked Hayes if he was in possession of a gun, and Hayes refused to answer. Another officer located a Glock handgun in the back pocket of Hayes' shorts, according to information from an arrest citation. The Glock 43 was loaded and a round chambered. Hayes was arrested and escorted from the pool area, which is located on the same property as Berea Community Schools and the Berea Independent Board of Education. He was charged with unlawful possession of a weapon on school property. Just a quick side note on gun laws in Kentucky. Anyone at least 18 years old can legally possess a handgun and carry it openly in the state. And thanks to a law passed in 2019, Kentuckians can even carry a concealed weapon without a permit, otherwise known as constitutional carry law. However, you must be over 21 in Kentucky to carry a concealed firearm without a permit. And while the state has some of the most lax laws in the country when it comes to gun regulation, possessing a firearm on school property is a Class D felony under federal and Kentucky law. We'll get more into gun stuff in a minute. Well, while the nation is dealing with one crisis, another is still very much vying for the top spot on our list of, oh no, what now? Nationally and in Kentucky, fatal drug overdoses have surged, in large part by opioid use and the prevalence of fentanyl, a powerful synthetic opioid increasingly added to other illicit drugs to boost potency. According to a recent federal report, drug overdose deaths in Kentucky rose 14% in 2021. The preliminary data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention shows Kentucky had 2,391 overdose deaths in 2021. That's up from 2020. Nationwide, more than 100,000 overdose deaths were reported in 2020, which is also up from the numbers in 2020. In Kentucky, early data shows that opioids and synthetic opioids such as fentanyl were the two main contributors for overdose deaths in 2021. To make matters worse, a separate analysis done by the University of Kentucky found the rate of drug overdose deaths among African Americans in Kentucky were more than doubled from 2016 and 2020. The mortality rate for Black Kentuckians increased nearly 117%, from 21 deaths for every 1,000 people in 2016 to 46 per 100,000 in 2020, according to the report. There is some good news on this front. On Monday, Kentucky took a step to turn a massive settlement into targeted action to combat opioid use as Attorney General Daniel Cameron announced members of a group which will oversee the disbursement of funds. The Bluegrass State will receive $483 million from settlements finalized this year with drug maker Johnson & Johnson and three major distributors of opioids. It was part of the $26 billion in nationwide settlements and lawsuits to hold opioid manufacturers accountable for their role in the current opioid epidemic. Half of Kentucky's settlement will flow directly to cities and counties for opioid use abatement efforts, according to Cameron. Projects will include intervention, treatment, and recovery services. I'm going to ask you to remember that story as we take a look at this week's in-depth topic of guns. I already mentioned how Kentucky has some of the most lax gun laws in the nation. It's so bad, in fact, that the state received an F grade from the Giffords Law Center to end gun violence. However, Kentucky's frontier pass, large community of outdoor enthusiasts and hunters, and vast rural and isolated areas makes it one of the states with consistently high numbers of gun ownership and sales. While there is no federal firearms registry, and due to the inability to track all gun sales through gun shows and online marketplaces, there's no true way to track the total number of guns sold in the states. However, if you look at last month's data from the FBI's Firearm Background Check database, which tabulates all the background checks ran through licensed firearm dealers when a gun is purchased, you can get a rough idea on the amount of sales in Kentucky. While nationwide gun sales have lessened, in Kentucky, it was the state with the most NICS background checks, with more than 300,000. Since January this year, a total of almost 2 million checks have been run through the system. To put that in perspective, there are approximately 4.5 million of people in the state, and that number of NICS background checks was just for 5 months. So with that in mind, it may be no surprise that Kentucky also ranks 8th in the nation for supplying crime guns to other states, meaning guns purchased legally in the state end up being used in crimes in other states, according to information from the Louisville division of the ATF. According to the Giffords Law Center, Kentucky is also the state with the 13th highest gun death rate. So with lax laws, a love of guns, and representatives who, in the midst of tearful testimony from guns violence survivors in a House committee hearing on Wednesday, said knee-jerk reactions to impose gun control policies that seek to curtail our constitutional right to bear arms are not the answer, what are the roughly half of Americans who support stricter gun laws supposed to do? The easy answer is to vote, but with the NRA and its massive and successful gun lobbying arm, history has shown even voting representatives in who will prioritize revising gun laws doesn't necessarily mean things will change. Crafting meaningful legislation is also tricky, as pro-gun activists often cite the Second Amendment as a bar to change. Which leads me back to the opioid lawsuits and settlement I mentioned earlier. Instead of asking our leaders to enact more legislation, we can simply ask them to repeal just one: the Protection of Lawful Commerce in the Arms Act, or the PLCCA. You see, back in the early 2000s, like the drug makers and the opioid lawsuits, gun manufacturers were getting hit hard in the court system with lawsuits from cities and families of victims of gun violence. One particular suit brought by the families of people shot by the sniper which terrorized the Washington, D.C. area, which killed 10 people, won a total of $2.5 million from the gun factor Bushmaster and the store that sold the weapon. Shortly after that, the firearm industries and the NRA started to lobby state legislators to try and secure immunity from these types of lawsuits. And they got it. The PLCCA was passed in 2005, which much to the relief of the NRA and firearms makers everywhere. Never before had Congress granted blanket immunity from civil litigation to an entire industry, as opposed to specific industry behavior. And the firearm industries, unlike drug manufacturers, is one of the few industries with such protection. The law prohibits people from pursuing civil suits against manufacturers, distributors, dealers, and importers of firearms or ammunition products, and their trade associations, for the harm solely caused by the criminal or unlawful misuse of firearm products or ammunition products by others when the product is functioned as designed and intended. While this protects them from most lawsuits, it isn't, shall we say, bulletproof. Essentially, a lawsuit is allowed under the PLCAA if a manufacturer, distributor, dealer, or importer itself violates an existing statute. And that's exactly how the families of those killed in the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting got $73 million in a settlement from Remington Arms, the company that made the Bushmaster, one of the guns used to kill 20 first graders and 6 adults. The families claimed that Remington Arms marketed, advertised, and promoted the Bushmaster XM50E2S for civilians to use to carry out offensive military-style combat missions against their perceived enemies. They said that this marketing was unethical and therefore violated Connecticut's Unfair Trade Practices Act, which they argued is a state statute applicable to the marketing of a firearm. But that's just one win, and doesn't really create a lot of room for other victims of gun violence to pursue that particular path, which is why the law needs to be repealed. But what about the gun manufacturers, you say? Isn't it unfair that they would be saddled with frivolous lawsuits anytime some random guy with a gun shoots someone? The firearms industry wasn't exactly hurting before the lawsuits of the late 90s and 2000s, nor in places like Kentucky's would sales likely be affected due to our gun laws. Repealing the PLCAA would put gun manufacturers back on the same playing field as other industries and put pressure on them to innovate and update their designs and safety features of guns sold in the U.S. Right now, that pressure simply doesn't exist. And they don't do those things because they don't have to. Lawsuits have shifted drug manufacturers' attempts to blame their victims for their addiction to the big pharma's responsibility for pushing the wide use of prescription narcotics despite the dangers. Highly embarrassing revelations in several court cases about the drug company's cynical marketing techniques helped pressure opioid makers and distributors into settling thousands of lawsuits over the opioid epidemic. Lawsuits create a space where research, tactics, and information becomes public. It also sometimes produces meaningful change. Take, for instance, the litigation against automotive manufacturers. It directly led to safety innovations such as seat belts, airbags, and conspicuous brake lights. Lawsuits against the tobacco industry produce research studies and warning labels. Sometimes litigation works for the greater good. Over the years, the gun industry has failed to do anything truly meaningful in the way of reducing the amount of gun violence in the U.S., and the NRA's lobbying arm has actively blocked any attempt to do so. Like the Dickey Amendment, which blocked the use of federal funds by the CDC to research gun violence for 25 years. There's more. Take, for instance, the innovation of smart gun technology. After a particularly bad loss in a lawsuit in the 90s, Smith & Wesson struck a deal with the Clinton administration in 1999 to develop and test smart gun technology. The NRA and its membership boycotted Smith & Wesson, eventually leading to the resignation of the president of the company. So, what is a smart gun? A smart gun is one that uses advanced technology that can detect its authorized user, essentially only firing when the authorized user has the gun in their hands. They typically employ RFID chips, proximity tokens, fingerprint recognition, magnetic rings, or mechanical locks to operate. much like we use facial recognition or thumbprints to unlock our phones. With the technology, smart guns could prevent accidental shootings, gun thefts, and criminal usage by persons not authorized to use the guns. Though Smith & Wesson planned to develop this technology in the 90s, it quickly dropped the idea in the face of immense backlash. To date, only one smart gun is reported to be on the market in the United States, the Armatix IP-1, a German-made gun that includes a handgun and a watch that the user must wear to activate the gun. Not surprisingly, when the NRA reviewed the gun, it gave the firearm a poor rating. However, the lobbying arm of the NRA insists it's not against smart guns, just regulation of them. A statement on its website says, the NRA doesn't oppose the development of smart guns, nor the ability of Americans to voluntarily acquire them. However, NRA opposes any law prohibiting Americans from acquiring and possessing firearms that don't possess smart gun technology. However, with just a few options being developed for the market and big manufacturers who have been burned in the past by attempting it, smart guns are nowhere near close to being widely available. The incorporation of smart technology costs money, which drives up the cost of guns. Reviewing and debugging such technology also takes time. Advanced safety and anti-theft features are great, but the gun still has to work when it's needed. And with very little oversight and pressure at present to innovate in such a way, the gun industry simply has not chosen to pursue it on a grand scale, even though nearly half of gun owners in the U.S. say they would consider buying a smart gun, according to a Johns Hopkins University study. But it's simply because they don't have to, and there's no motivation to do so. All it would take would be one case to make it to the Supreme Court to pressure the gun industry into action. Even still, that would take years. And we're running out of time. Gun violence and mass shootings continue to rise. More people senselessly die. We mourn the losses, but then we do nothing. And we must do something. The first step is getting those involved in this crisis to admit their responsibility for it. And believe me, we all bear some responsibility for this. But it's time to bring those who were shielded before into the fray with us. The gun industry can't have total immunity, or they will continue, like the drug industry with the opioid crisis, to dodge their portion of the blame. While the gun industry and the NRA remain untouchable, trying to craft any significant approach to gun violence is much like bringing a knife to a literal gunfight. And that's it for this week's Priority Report. Join me next week when I tell you the news you need to know about. Thanks for watching.
The Priority Report is brought to you by Cumberland Valley National Bank. Trusted for banking, known for caring. Visit them at cvnb.com. Chenault Vineyards, a place to create beautiful experiences. Visit them online at chenaultvineyards.com and kymedia.net.